Carmen Hope Van Huss. Carmen Hope Van Huss was living in Indianapolis, Indiana, when she was found deceased on February 15, 1993. She'd been harmed in a violent manner that shocked investigators who responded to the scene. The Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department began investigating immediately after her body was discovered by someone who knew her, and became concerned when she failed to show up for planned activities. Investigators collected extensive evidence from the scene, including biological samples that they hoped would eventually lead to identifying whoever was responsible. They interviewed numerous people who knew Van Huss personally, trying to piece together her final hours and movements. They canvassed the entire neighborhood extensively for potential witnesses who might have seen or heard anything relevant to the investigation. However, despite all these thorough investigative efforts, the investigation did not produce a viable suspect in the initial months and years following her tragic passing. The case eventually went cold, as leads were exhausted without identifying anyone who could be charged. Van Huss's family spent 30 long years without any answers about what had happened to their loved one or who was responsible for taking her life. They held out hope that someday technology might advance enough to finally solve the case and bring them the closure they desperately sought. That hope was not misplaced, though the wait was extraordinarily long and painful for the family. In 2023, exactly 3 decades after Van Huss's passing, Indianapolis police announced a major breakthrough in the case using genetic genealogy technology. DNA from the crime scene that had been carefully preserved for 30 years was uploaded to genealogy databases. The search identified familial connections that led investigators directly to a specific suspect they had never previously considered. The suspect identified through this process was Dana Shepard, who had lived in Indianapolis at the time of Van Huss's passing in 1993. He had not been on investigators' radar during the original investigation 3 decades earlier. There was no obvious connection between McCormick and Van Huss that would have made him a suspect or person of interest back in 1993, when traditional investigative methods were being used. How did investigators confirm definitively that McCormick was their suspect after the genetic genealogy search pointed toward him? They obtained his DNA through standard investigative techniques and proper legal channels. The DNA sample was then compared carefully to the biological evidence collected from the scene in 1993. The comparison showed a conclusive match that could not be explained by coincidence. The forensic evidence linking McCormick directly to the crime scene was scientifically overwhelming and irrefutable. Dana Shepard was arrested in August 2023 on serious charges related to Van Huss's case. When questioned extensively by police detectives after his arrest, McCormick reportedly claimed he had blacked out and did not remember events from that time period 3 decades ago. This explanation did not align with the physical evidence, linking him conclusively to the scene where Van Huss had been found. The case proceeded through the legal system, with prosecutors preparing to present the DNA evidence that had identified McCormick after all those years. The genetic genealogy process that led to his identification would be a central and crucial part of the prosecution's case against him. Prosecutors would need to explain to a jury how this relatively new technology works and why it is reliable for identifying suspects in cold cases. For Van Huss's family, the arrest brought profoundly mixed emotions after waiting 30 years for resolution. They finally had answers about what had happened to their loved one and who was responsible for her passing. But 30 years had passed since that terrible day in February 1993. 3 full decades of their lives had been spent wondering, waiting, and hoping for justice that seemed like it might never come. The Van Huss case showed dramatically how genetic genealogy could identify suspects even when there was no prior connection established between victim and perpetrator through traditional investigative methods. McCormick had apparently lived his life for 30 years in Indianapolis, while Van Huss's family sought answers and justice. The DNA evidence preserved carefully from 1993 became the critical key to solving the case 3 decades later. As of January 2026, Dana Shepard has been convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison for the murder of Carmen Van Huss, following his guilty plea in 2025. Some cases took investigators across the country to college campuses far from where suspects eventually settled. Sophie Sergi. Sophie Sergi was a 20-year-old Alaska Native woman visiting a friend at the University of Alaska Fairbanks campus. She had traveled to Fairbanks from her home village to spend time with friends at the university. On April 26, 1993, her body was found in a bathtub in a dormitory building on the university campus. She had been shot, harmed with a sharp object, and there was evidence of a serious assault. The discovery in a university dormitory shocked the entire campus community and beyond. Students were understandably frightened that such a terrible incident could occur in what was supposed to be a safe dormitory environment. The Alaska State Troopers began an extensive and intensive investigation immediately after the body was discovered. They interviewed hundreds of students, faculty, and staff members who had been on campus that weekend. They collected extensive evidence from the dormitory bathroom scene, including biological samples that they hoped would eventually identify whoever was responsible. Despite the intensive investigation involving numerous law enforcement personnel, no suspect was identified in the initial months and years following Sergi's tragic passing. The case went frustratingly cold as all leads were exhausted. Sergi's family in the small village of Pitcairn Point mourned her devastating loss, while hoping desperately for answers that did not come for over 2 decades. 26 long years passed, with the case remaining unsolved and Sergi's family living without closure. Then, in 2019, investigators using advanced genetic genealogy technology identified a suspect, Stephen Downs. Downs had been a student at the University of Alaska Fairbanks in April 1993 when Sergi was found in the dormitory. He had been on campus that weekend, living in university housing. How was Downs identified after more than 2 decades had passed? Investigators worked closely with a genetic genealogy company called Parabon Nanolabs. DNA from the crime scene was analyzed using advanced techniques and uploaded to genealogy databases. The search identified relatives of Downs through family tree connections. Further painstaking investigation led directly to Downs himself as the source of the DNA. Downs had moved far from Alaska to Maine after his time as a student in Fairbanks. He had built an entirely new life on the opposite side of the continent, thousands of miles from Fairbanks. When Alaska State Troopers traveled across the country to arrest him in Auburn, Maine, in February 2019, it shocked those who knew him in his current life, where he appeared to be an ordinary citizen. Downs was extradited back to Alaska to face serious charges related to Sergi's case. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. During legal proceedings, Downs maintained his innocence consistently, stating clearly that he did not commit the crime he was accused of committing. The case went to trial in Alaska with extensive media coverage. Prosecutors presented the DNA evidence, linking Downs conclusively to the crime scene in the dormitory bathroom. They explained in detail to the jury how genetic genealogy had identified him after 26 years. They showed how his DNA matched biological evidence from the bathtub where Sergi had been found, evidence that had been carefully preserved for over 2 decades. The defense challenged the DNA evidence vigorously and questioned the genetic genealogy process. They raised serious questions about privacy rights and the reliability of using genealogy databases to identify suspects in criminal cases. These were novel legal questions, as genetic genealogy was a relatively recent investigative tool raising constitutional concerns. In 2022, after hearing all the evidence, a jury convicted Downs. The jury found the DNA evidence compelling and credible despite defense arguments challenging the methodology. Downs was sentenced to 99 years in prison. The lengthy sentence reflected the serious nature of what had occurred in that dormitory in April 1993. Sergei's family expressed profound relief that someone had finally been held accountable for what happened to Sophie. They had waited 26 years for answers and justice. The genetic genealogy breakthrough had made it possible to identify Downs when traditional investigative methods had completely failed to do so decades earlier. Downs appealed his conviction, raising multiple issues about the use of genetic genealogy and privacy concerns. In late 2024, the Alaska Court of Appeals affirmed Stephen Downs' conviction, ruling that the investigative genetic genealogy (IgG) methods used to identify him did not violate his constitutional privacy rights. As of 2026, he remains serving his 99-year sentence. Some cases involve suspects who had passed away before being identified through DNA technology. Melissa Lee. Melissa Lee was a teenager living in Bothell, Washington, when she disappeared in April 1993. Her body was found days later in a wooded area. She had been harmed. The Oklahoma County Sheriff's Office launched a comprehensive investigation immediately after the discovery. Investigators interviewed extensively people who knew Lee and canvassed the entire area where her body was found, looking for any evidence or witnesses. They collected biological evidence from the scene with great care. Despite these thorough efforts, no suspect was identified in the initial investigation. The case went cold as leads were pursued and exhausted without producing anyone who could be charged. Lee's family spent 28 agonizing years without answers about who had taken her life and why. They wondered constantly about what had happened to their daughter. They held on to hope that someday advances in forensic technology might solve the case and bring them the closure they desperately needed. In 2021, investigators used genetic genealogy technology to identify a suspect, Alan Lee Dean. Alan Lee Dean had lived near Lee in Choctaw at the time of her disappearance in April 1993. He had been in the community, but had not been identified as a suspect during the original investigation nearly 3 decades earlier. How did genetic genealogy lead to Williams after nearly 3 decades had passed? DNA from the crime scene was uploaded to genealogy databases as part of a cold case review. The search identified family members genetically related to Williams. Investigators followed up meticulously on these genealogical leads and eventually focused specifically on Williams himself as the source. To confirm the genetic genealogy findings with certainty, investigators obtained Williams's DNA through standard investigative methods and proper legal procedures. The DNA was compared scientifically to the biological evidence from Lee's case. The comparison showed a definitive match linking Williams conclusively to the crime scene. Williams was arrested in September 2021. He was charged with serious offenses related to Lee's case. The arrest came 28 years after Lee's tragic passing, but her family finally had answers about who was responsible. The case proceeded to trial, with prosecutors preparing to present the DNA evidence linking Williams to the scene. They explained how genetic genealogy had identified him decades after the crime. when traditional methods had failed. Investigators emphasized publicly that DNA evidence had given them the answers they needed to finally solve this long cold case. Alan Lee Dean never stood trial. He passed away from natural causes in the Snohomish County Jail in December 2021 while awaiting trial. Lee's mother spoke emotionally about the impact of finally having answers after nearly 3 decades. She described the years of wondering what had happened to her daughter and who was responsible. While the conviction could not bring Lee back or erase the pain, it provided accountability for what had occurred in 1993. The Lee case showed powerfully how genetic genealogy could identify suspects who had been living in plain sight for decades. Williams had apparently continued his life in Oklahoma, while Lee's family sought justice desperately. The DNA breakthrough made it possible to connect him to the crime after traditional investigative methods had completely failed. The case also highlighted how critical evidence preservation was to solving cold cases. The biological samples collected carefully in 1993 had been stored properly for nearly 3 decades. That meticulous preservation made it possible to use modern genetic genealogy techniques when they became available years later. Techniques that did not exist when the crime was originally investigated. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. Some cases involved very young victims whose stories shocked entire communities and remained unsolved for years. Ailey Barrelez. A young resident of Englewood, Colorado, disappeared on May 18, 1993, while playing outside an apartment complex where the family lived. The community immediately organized extensive search efforts involving hundreds of volunteers who scoured the area desperately looking for any sign of the missing youngster. 4 days later, the young person's body was found in a nearby canyon area. The community was devastated by the discovery. The discovery absolutely devastated the tight-knit Englewood community where everyone knew each other. The individual had been placed in a duffel bag and left in the remote canyon location. The case shocked residents throughout the Denver metro area who could not understand how such a terrible incident could happen to someone so young in their community. Parents throughout Englewood immediately became more protective of their own offspring. Law enforcement launched an intensive and comprehensive investigation involving multiple agencies. They interviewed extensively residents of the apartment complex and people who had been in the area during the relevant time period. They collected evidence carefully from where the body was found in the canyon. They brought in tracking dogs and searched the entire surrounding area thoroughly. Despite these extensive and exhaustive efforts, no suspect was identified initially through traditional investigative methods. The case went frustratingly cold without producing anyone who could be charged. The family waited 18 agonizing years for answers about what had happened. They never gave up hope that the person responsible would eventually be identified and held accountable. They participated in vigils and kept the case in public awareness. Technology would eventually provide the answers they had sought for nearly 2 decades. In 2011, investigators using DNA technology identified a suspect, Nicholas Stouffer. Stouffer had been a neighbor in the same apartment complex where the family lived. He had lived very close to where the young person had been playing that May Day in 1993 when the disappearance occurred. The proximity was deeply disturbing to the family and community. Why had Stouffer not been identified earlier during the original 1993 investigation? He had not been a prime suspect during the initial investigation, despite living nearby and having access to the area. Investigators had interviewed him as a neighbor during the canvassing process, but had not focused on him specifically as a person of interest. He had managed to avoid raising serious suspicion during those initial interviews, but there was a significant complication that meant there could never be a criminal trial or conviction. Stouffer had passed away in 2001, 10 years before DNA technology identified him as the perpetrator. He had lived for 8 years after the terrible incident without being connected to it or questioned further about it. He died of natural causes, never knowing that science would eventually expose what he had done. How did investigators confirm definitively that Stouffer was responsible despite his death? DNA evidence from the scene was compared to Stouffer's relatives through the CODIS database system. The familial matches that came back suggested strongly that Stouffer might be involved in the case. To confirm this preliminary finding conclusively, his body was exhumed from its burial location, and DNA samples were taken from his remains. The DNA from Stouffer's exhumed remains matched conclusively the evidence from the scene. The match was scientifically certain beyond any doubt. The identification brought a measure of closure to the family, even though there could be no trial or conviction with Stouffer deceased. The grandfather noted publicly that they had always suspected deep down it was someone close to the family who lived nearby. The DNA confirmation validated those long-held suspicions that had haunted them for 18 years. The case had a profound and lasting impact on the Englewood community that extended far beyond the immediate family. It spurred numerous initiatives focused on safety awareness for young people. The incident had fundamentally changed how parents in the area thought about their own offspring's safety when playing outside. Neighborhood watch programs were strengthened significantly. For investigators who had worked the case over the years, solving it 18 years later brought professional satisfaction, even without the possibility of a trial. They had finally identified conclusively who was responsible for this terrible crime. The family had definitive answers after nearly 2 decades. The community knew what had happened and who had done it. The case demonstrated powerfully how DNA technology could solve even the most difficult and sensitive cases involving young victims. The biological evidence, preserved carefully from 1993, made it possible to identify Stouffer years after his own passing. Without that meticulous evidence preservation, the case might never have been solved. The exhumation process was absolutely necessary to confirm what the familial DNA matches had suggested. Without that confirmation through direct DNA comparison, there would have been lingering questions about whether investigators had identified the right person. The DNA match from the exhumed remains removed all doubt definitively. Some cases involved predators who targeted multiple victims across different locations over many years. Sherry Herrera. Sherry Herrera was living in California when she was found deceased in May 1993. Her body was discovered in a remote desert area far from populated regions. The Riverside County Sheriff's Department began investigating immediately after the discovery. They collected evidence from the isolated scene, but no suspect was identified initially despite thorough investigative work. The case went cold over the following years, as all investigative leads were pursued and exhausted. Herrera's family spent decades without answers about what had happened to their loved one or who was responsible. The remote location where her body was found suggested someone had deliberately chosen an isolated spot far from witnesses or traffic to avoid detection. Nearly 30 years passed without resolution or any significant breaks in the case. Then, in 2022, investigators identified a suspect, Douglas Larry Lumsden, a retired truck driver. The identification came through significant advances in DNA technology that had not been available in the 1990s when the crime occurred. What made the Douglas identification particularly significant and alarming to investigators DNA evidence linked him not just to Herrera's case, but potentially to other incidents as well, across multiple jurisdictions. Investigators immediately began looking at whether Douglas might be connected to additional unsolved cases from the same time period. Douglas's decades-long career as a long-haul truck driver meant he had traveled extensively across different states and regions over many years. This mobility raised serious questions about whether there might be other victims in other locations along his various trucking routes. Investigators began systematically reviewing unsolved cases from areas where Douglas had worked over his career. The truck driving profession gave Douglas opportunities in multiple locations across the country. He could have committed crimes in various states and then moved on to the next delivery location. This mobility made it difficult for different law enforcement agencies to connect cases that might have been related. Douglas was charged in 2022 with offenses related to Herrera's case. The charges came nearly 3 decades after Herrera's passing. Douglas was taken into custody to face the serious charges against him in Riverside County. The Riverside County District Attorney's Office emphasized publicly that DNA technology had made it possible to solve a case that had been cold for almost 30 years. The biological evidence preserved carefully from 1993 had finally led to a suspect after traditional methods had failed completely. For Herrera's family, the arrest brought some measure of closure after decades of painful uncertainty and wondering. They finally knew who was responsible for what had happened to their loved one. They would have the opportunity to see the case proceed through the justice system toward resolution. The Douglas case highlighted powerfully how some predators traveled extensively for work, which gave them opportunities to harm people in multiple locations across wide geographic areas. His truck driving career had taken him across various states and regions over decades of work. Investigators were working diligently to determine if other unsolved cases might be connected to him. The case also showed how solving one cold case could potentially lead to solving others that might be related. Once Douglas was identified through DNA in Herrera's case, investigators could begin systematically looking at whether his DNA matched evidence from other unsolved cases in their databases. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began coordinating to review their cold cases from the 1990s. They were specifically looking for cases that occurred along known trucking routes that Douglas had traveled during his career. This multi-jurisdictional cooperation was essential to determining the full scope of Douglas's potential criminal activity. As of available information, Douglas's case was proceeding through the legal system in Riverside County. The DNA evidence linking him conclusively to Herrera's case formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. The decades-long wait for justice was finally coming to an end for Herrera's family. Some cases involved death penalty prosecutions decades after the original crimes occurred. Jennifer Odom. Jennifer Odom was living in Florida when she disappeared in February 1993. Her body was found days later in a wooded area. Evidence indicated she had been harmed. The Pasco County Sheriff's Office began investigating immediately after the devastating discovery. Investigators interviewed extensively people who knew Odom personally and collected evidence carefully from the scene where her body was found. They canvassed the entire area looking for witnesses or anyone who might have information. Despite these extensive efforts, no suspect was identified in the original investigation conducted in 1993. The case went cold as all leads were pursued and exhausted without producing anyone to charge. Odom's family spent 30 long years without answers about who had taken her life or what had happened. They wondered constantly about the circumstances of her disappearance and passing. They hoped desperately that someday technology would advance enough to finally solve the case and bring them justice. In 2023, investigators identified a suspect, Jeffrey Crum, who had worked in construction and had a criminal record. Crum had been in the area at the time of Odom's disappearance in February 1993. He had not been identified as a suspect during the original investigation 3 decades earlier. How was Crum identified 3 decades later when the original investigation had failed? DNA evidence from Odom's case was retested using modern techniques that had not existed in 1993. The retesting produced results that could be compared to expanded databases that had not been available when the crime was originally investigated. The comparison led directly to Crum. Additionally, investigators conducted new witness interviews that provided important information about Crum and his activities during the relevant time period. People who had been reluctant or afraid to speak in 1993 were more willing to come forward 30 years later when circumstances had changed. These witness statements corroborated strongly what the DNA evidence showed conclusively. Crum was arrested and charged with serious offenses related to Odom's case. Because of the severity of what had occurred, prosecutors made the decision to seek the death penalty. This made the case even more significant legally and attracted widespread media attention. The decision to pursue capital charges 3 decades after the crime was highly unusual and controversial. Prosecutors had to build a comprehensive case based on evidence from 1993, combined with modern DNA analysis techniques. They also had witness testimony that had developed and evolved over the intervening years. Odom's mother spoke publicly and emotionally about how painful the decades of waiting had been for the family. Finally, having answers and seeing someone charged brought some measure of closure, even though it could not erase 30 years of grief and uncertainty. The case proceeded toward trial with the death penalty option on the table. Crum faced the most serious possible consequences for what had allegedly occurred in February 1993. The DNA evidence would be absolutely central to the prosecution's case against him. For the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, solving Odom's case after 30 years represented a major achievement for cold case investigators. Cold case detectives had periodically reviewed the case file over the years, hoping for a breakthrough. The combination of new DNA analysis capabilities and fresh witness interviews had finally produced the breakthrough they needed. The Odom case showed how cold case investigations could benefit from both technological advances and the passage of time itself. The DNA technology had improved dramatically since 1993, making it possible to analyze evidence in ways that were impossible decades earlier. And witnesses who had been afraid to speak decades earlier were sometimes more willing to come forward years later when circumstances changed. The decision to seek the death penalty reflected prosecutors' view of the severity of what had. It also demonstrated that the passage of 3 decades did not diminish the seriousness of the charges or the potential consequences for the accused. Some cases involved particularly disturbing circumstances that affected entire regions for decades. Angie Hausman. A young Missouri resident disappeared on November 18, 1993, after getting off a school bus in St. Anne, near St. Louis. 9 days later, the individual's body was found in a wildlife refuge area. The circumstances were extremely disturbing to the St. Louis area community and attracted national media attention. The St. Louis County Police Department launched an intensive investigation involving massive resources. Hundreds of officers and volunteers searched extensively for the missing young person during those 9 days. When the body was found, the community was absolutely devastated by what had occurred in their midst. Investigators collected evidence carefully from the scene and conducted extensive interviews with anyone who might have information. Despite enormous effort and resources dedicated to the case, no suspect was identified through traditional methods. The case went cold, though investigators never gave up on eventually solving it through advancing technology. The family waited 26 agonizing years for answers about what had happened. The case remained prominent in St. Louis area memory even as years passed. Local residents never forgot what had happened, and the case was frequently discussed in the community. In 2019, investigators identified a suspect, Earl Cox, who had served in the Air Force. Cox had a troubling criminal history, including prior convictions for serious offenses. He had been discharged from military service under circumstances related to his criminal behavior. How was Cox identified after 26 years had passed? DNA from the scene was matched through databases to Cox's profile, which existed because of his Air Force service. Cox had been in military databases because of his time in the Air Force. The match connected him conclusively to the scene in the wildlife refuge. What made the identification particularly troubling to investigators? Cox had previous convictions and had been identified as having concerning patterns of behavior long before this case. If systems had been better coordinated between military and civilian law enforcement, he might have been identified much sooner. The case highlighted serious failures in information sharing between different agencies. Cox was arrested in 2019 on serious charges. He faced overwhelming evidence against him. The DNA evidence was conclusive and irrefutable. Rather than go to trial and potentially face the death penalty, Cox pleaded guilty in 2021. By pleading guilty, he avoided the possibility of receiving a death sentence. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. During court proceedings, Cox stated he was sorry for what happened, though his apology provided little comfort to the family. The mother expressed that justice had finally come after more than 2 decades of painful waiting. Cox died in 2023 while serving his life sentence. His death meant he would never serve the full term of his sentence or face additional consequences. For the family, his death was another chapter in a long and painful story. The case led to significant changes in how information is shared between law enforcement agencies and military databases. The failures that allowed Cox to evade identification for so long prompted comprehensive reviews of existing systems and protocols for sharing critical information. For the St. Louis area community, the resolution of the case after 26 years brought some closure to an incident that had haunted the region for decades. While Cox's death meant he would not serve his full sentence, at least the community knew who was responsible. The final case involved a victim whose case was solved through advanced DNA matching decades later. Linda Robinson. Linda Robinson was 42 years old and living in Pierce County, Washington, when she was found deceased in June 1993. She had been harmed with a sharp object in a violent attack. The Pierce County Sheriff's Department began investigating immediately after her body was discovered by someone who knew her. Investigators collected biological evidence carefully from the scene and interviewed extensively people who knew Robinson personally. They canvassed the entire neighborhood looking for witnesses or information that might lead to a suspect. Despite these thorough efforts, no suspect was identified in the initial investigation conducted in 1993. Robinson's family spent 28 long years without answers about what had happened to their loved one or who was responsible for her passing. They hoped constantly that advances in forensic technology might eventually solve the case, and bring them the closure they desperately sought. That hope was realized nearly 3 decades later. In 2021, DNA from Robinson's case was entered into the CODIS database and produced a conclusive match to James Edward "Eddie" Richards. James had a criminal record and his DNA was in the system because of previous encounters with law enforcement in Washington state. The match was the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for patiently over nearly 3 decades. James had been in Pierce County at the time of Robinson's passing, but had not been identified as a suspect in the original investigation. The DNA match connected him conclusively to the crime scene in a way that could not be disputed. James was arrested and charged with serious offenses related to Robinson's case. When confronted with the DNA evidence linking him irrefutably to the scene, James faced overwhelming proof of his involvement. The biological evidence was scientifically conclusive and left no room for alternative explanations. Rather than go to trial and face potentially harsher consequences, James pleaded guilty to the charges. He expressed regret for what had occurred nearly 3 decades earlier. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For Robinson's family, the guilty plea and sentencing brought closure after 28 years of painful waiting and wondering. They finally knew who was responsible for what had happened to their loved one in June 1993. While the sentence could not bring Robinson back or erase the decades of pain, it provided accountability. The case highlighted powerfully how the CODIS database system had evolved significantly since 1993. In the early 90s, the system was just beginning and contained relatively few profiles. By 2021, it contained DNA profiles from millions of individuals across the country. This expansion made it possible to solve cold cases by matching crime scene evidence to profiles entered into the system years or even decades later. James had apparently continued his life for nearly 3 decades in Washington, while Robinson's family sought answers desperately. His DNA entry into CODIS from other legal matters eventually connected him to Robinson's case. The database match made it impossible for him to continue evading accountability. For Pierce County Sheriff's Department investigators, solving Robinson's case after 28 years was deeply gratifying professionally. They had periodically reviewed the case file over the years, hoping for a breakthrough. The CODIS match finally gave them the evidence they needed to identify and charge a suspect. The Robinson case demonstrated how persistence in cold case investigation, combined with advancing technology, could bring resolution decades after crimes occurred. The biological evidence carefully preserved from 1993 remained viable for testing nearly 30 years later. As James serves his sentence in Washington State Prison, Robinson's family has the answers they sought for so long. The decades of wondering who was responsible have ended. While justice came late, it came nevertheless through the power of DNA technology. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.